The official records of Jefferson County denote the autumn of 1837 as a season of peculiar dryness, a detail that would later prove fatal for the agricultural aristocracy of the region. Near the crumbling settlement of Rodney, Mississippi, the Greenwood Place plantation sat heavy under the gaze of a copper moon, its air thick with the stagnant breath of the river. Silas, a man whom the plantation ledgers reduced to a line item of inventory, stood watch over the harvest accumulation. He was a figure of imposing physicality, his frame carved by years of forced toil, yet his demeanor was one of practiced invisibility. The storage yard was a labyrinth of wealth, containing the pressed fiber that represented the lifeblood of the estate and the silence of the men who harvested it. This particular night, the atmosphere felt charged, vibrating with a tension that resonated in Silas's chest. He was not merely guarding a commodity. He was watching over the instrument of his own potential liberation. The cotton gins had been running relentlessly, and the haste of the season had led to a critical error in the storage logistics, an oversight that did not escape Silas's astute observation. The massive rectangular bales were stacked without the requisite fire breaks, creating a dense, contiguous mountain of combustible material in the center of the yard. Above, the branches of the ancient oaks drooped with desiccated leaves, brittle as parchment, after weeks without rain. Silas raised a calloused hand to the air, testing the currents. A steady driving breeze blew from the south, funneling directly toward the manor house and the distant river. It was a perfect confluence of conditions, a careless architecture of destruction waiting for a spark. The realization settled upon him with the weight of an iron yoke, terrifying in its possibility. Pseudo-documentary evidence suggests that the plan for emancipation at Greenwood Place was not born of a sudden fury, but of a calculated, desperate patience. Silas understood the topography of his confinement with a precision that his overseers lacked. He noted the dry rot on the lower bales and the proximity of the stacks to the wooden sheds. To a casual observer, the yard was a picture of agricultural abundance. To Silas, it was a powder keg. He gripped the wooden handle of his watchman's club, his knuckles whitening as he mentally traced the path the fire would take. The flames would not just consume the cotton. They would sever the financial artery of his master, Marcus Caldwell, and provide the only conceivable cover for an escape that had previously seemed impossible. His reverie was broken by the rhythmic thud of boots on packed earth, a sound that signaled the approach of authority. Silas straightened his spine, rearranging his features into a mask of placid subservience, a survival skill honed over decades. The overseer, a man named Hatcher, emerged from the shadows, his presence heralded by the jingle of spurs and the pungent scent of tobacco. Hatcher was a man who carried his power like a weapon, swinging it with casual cruelty to remind the enslaved of their station. He stopped before Silas, his eyes scanning the yard not for safety, but for flaw, for an excuse to exert his dominance. The tension in the air thickened, becoming a palpable barrier between the two men. Hatcher's gaze landed on a single bale that sat slightly askew, a minor imperfection in the regimented rows. He sneered, kicking the dense fiber with the toe of his boot. "You think you're guarding gold, Silas? This trash is worth more than your whole lineage." Hatcher spat, his voice low and mocking. He stepped closer, invading Silas's space, his hand resting threateningly on the belt that held his whip. One spark, one accident, and Master Caldwell would have your hide tacked to the barn door before he'd worry about the loss. Don't forget what you are. The words were intended to demean, to reinforce the hierarchy that deemed property superior to human life. Silas remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a point beyond Hatcher's shoulder, refusing to engage in the challenge the overseer sought. Inside, however, the words acted as a bellows to a furnace. The dehumanization was not new, but tonight it struck a nerve exposed by the opportunity before him. He felt the wooden club in his hand not as a symbol of trust, but as a tool of potential retribution. Hatcher, satisfied that he had cowed the guard into silence, spat a stream of juice near Silas's feet and turned to continue his rounds. As the overseer's footsteps receded, a chilling resolve solidified in Silas's gut. The decision was no longer a formless desire. It was a contract with fate. The night deepened, wrapping the plantation in a shroud of darkness that felt almost tactile. Silas waited until the sound of Hatcher's patrol had fully dissolved into the ambient chirping of crickets. He then moved with a deliberate silence, shedding the persona of the passive guard. He needed to confirm the feasibility of the strike. He circled the perimeter of the stack, identifying the precise point where the wind would best catch the initial flame. The plan required more than just fire. It required a divergence, a spectacle of such magnitude that the entire machinery of the plantation would grind to a halt in panic. He visualized the chaos, the running figures, the shouting, and amidst that disorder, a small window of opportunity for a different kind of disappearance. Historical accounts of resistance often highlight the theft of self that precedes the theft of property. Silas's next moves were dictated by a rigorous internal strategy. He knew he needed a flint and steel, items strictly prohibited to those in his position. He recalled the blacksmith's discard pile, a graveyard of broken tools and useless shards he had passed earlier that day while running errands. The risk of being caught with such contraband was severe, potentially fatal. Yet the risk of inaction had become unbearable. He slipped away from his post, moving like a shadow toward the smithy, his mind racing through the inventory of necessary components to turn the cotton field into a beacon of freedom. The blacksmith's shed loomed in the darkness, a silhouette of soot-stained timber. Silas approached with caution, his senses heightened to a painful degree. He found the refuse pile exactly as he remembered, a chaotic heap of slag and scrap. His fingers, calloused yet sensitive, sifted through the debris until they closed around a jagged shard of flint and a chipped piece of steel. These were worthless fragments to the smith, but to Silas, they were the keys to a new existence. He secreted them into a hidden pocket he had fashioned within the lining of his trousers. The weight of the metal against his skin was a burning reminder of the path he had chosen. Returning to the yard, Silas's thoughts turned to Cora. The fire was only half the equation. The other half was her safe passage. He needed to ensure the wind would carry the flames away from the route she would take. He looked toward the dense tree line bordering the property, the beginning of the treacherous journey north. The wind continued to blow steady and true, a guide as much as a weapon. He positioned himself near the center of the cotton stacks, the stolen tools heavy in his pocket, and waited for the signal of deep night, the moment when the plantation would be most vulnerable to the spark that would rewrite its history. The acquisition of the flint and steel acted as a physical catalyst within Silas, transforming his abstract desire for freedom into a tangible, terrifying objective. He was no longer a passive guardian of his master's wealth, but an active agent of his own destiny, a shift in identity that was as dangerous as it was exhilarating. The weight of the stolen items in his pocket served as a constant reminder of the treason he was committing against the institution of slavery, a crime for which he could expect no mercy, only a brutal execution. He understood implicitly that there was no retreat from this path. The procurement of these tools was the crossing of a threshold. To turn back now would be to live the rest of his life in the shadow of what might have been, a fate he considered worse than death. His movements became more deliberate, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge as he awaited the appointed hour. Silas's preparations extended beyond the mere mechanics of fire. He required an accelerant to ensure the cotton ignited with the speed and ferocity necessary to create an unmanageable chaos. The plantation kitchens, a domain of sweltering heat and frantic activity during the day, had long since settled into a quiet slumber, presenting a solitary opportunity for procurement. He moved toward the outbuilding, his bare feet making no sound on the cool, packed earth of the yard. Earlier, during his sanctioned duties, he had noted the location of a bin where the cooks discarded rags used for cleaning the roasting spits and wiping down the heavy iron pots. These rags, soaked in rendered lard and spilled oils, were the perfect tinder to nurse the spark from his stolen flint into a devouring flame. Slipping into the shadow of the kitchen shed, Silas paused, listening for any sound that might indicate a waking presence or a late-night patrol. The silence was heavy, broken only by the settling of the wooden structure and the distant mournful call of a nightbird. He located the bin and plunged his hand inside, his fingers closing around a bundle of fabric that felt stiff and greasy to the touch. The smell of rancid fat and old smoke filled his nostrils, a pungent odor that usually signified menial labor, but tonight represented the fuel of liberation. He tucked the bundle securely inside his shirt, the oily residue staining his skin, a small price to pay for the promise of the inferno to come. With the components of his rebellion now assembled, Silas turned his thoughts to the intricate web of timing that would determine their success or failure. He knew that Hatcher, despite his arrogance, was a creature of habit, and his rounds were predictable in their irregularity. The overseer would likely return to his cabin for a draught of whiskey before making his final inspection of the night, providing a brief window of vulnerability. Silas calculated the minutes, syncing his internal clock with the rhythm of the plantation. He had to strike the spark and ensure the fire had taken hold before the alarm could be raised, yet he needed enough time to position himself advantageously for the ensuing confusion. It was a high-stakes gamble with lives as the currency. The most critical variable in this equation was Cora. Silas had spent weeks subtly communicating with his wife, establishing a plan that relied as much on faith as it did on strategy. They had agreed that on the first night of a strong south wind, when the moon was obscured, she would be ready. She was a woman of quiet strength, her spirit tempered by the same fires of oppression that had forged Silas's resolve. But she possessed a grace and resourcefulness that he knew would be essential for the journey north. He had to trust that she would sense the change in the air, that she would understand the signal when the sky turned orange and the night erupted into chaos. Their plan was a masterpiece of whispered conversations and coded language, a secret dialect constructed under the noses of those who believed them incapable of complex thought. Silas would create the diversion, a massive conflagration that would draw every able body away from the slave quarters and the perimeter of the estate. In that window of pandemonium, while the overseers and the master were consumed with saving the lucrative crop, Cora would slip away, vanishing into the tree line that bordered the fields. It was a desperate scheme that required split-second timing and absolute trust, a testament to the bond that the system had tried so desperately to sever, but had only strengthened. As Silas waited for the optimal moment to approach the cotton stacks, he reviewed the path he had laid out for her in his mind. He had spent days secretly marking a trail through the nearby woods, using the natural environment as his guidebook. A broken branch here, a stack of stones there, signs that would be invisible to a pursuer, but glaringly obvious to a heart looking for hope. The thought of her traversing that dangerous terrain alone sent a spike of fear through him, cold and sharp. Yet he knew that her safety was the only thing that made his own survival worthwhile. The fire he was about to set was not just an act of destruction. It was a beacon guiding her toward a future where they could be more than property. The tension in the air seemed to thicken as the night wore on, the silence becoming a physical weight that pressed against Silas's eardrums. He could feel the hum of the plantation, the low-frequency vibration of sleeping lives and suppressed sorrows. He knew that what he was about to do would shatter that fragile peace, exposing everyone left behind to the wrath of Master Caldwell. The potential for collective punishment hung over his head, a moral burden that he had wrestled with and ultimately cast aside. The fire was a necessary violence, a surgical strike against the economy that enslaved them all, and its shock waves would be felt long after he and Cora had vanished. Finally, the signal he had been waiting for arrived. The distant sound of Hatcher's cabin door slamming shut, followed by the dull thud of a bar dropping into place. The overseer had retired for his nightly respite. Silas exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The yard was now truly alone, save for the silent sentinels of cotton. He stepped forward, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The time for contemplation was over. The moment for action had arrived. He moved toward the center of the storage yard, the grease-stained bundle tucked tight against his ribs, his hand clutching the flint and steel in his pocket. As he walked, Silas felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from a great distance. The man who had endured years of degradation, who had bowed his head and swallowed his pride, was fading away. In his place stood a warrior, a liberator, and an arsonist. He approached the dense wall of cotton bales, the white gold that represented the wealth of the South and the misery of its people. He was about to make a deposit of his own, a spark that would grow into a roar, a shout of defiance that would echo far beyond the boundaries of Greenwood Place. The night was about to catch fire, and Silas was the one who would light the match. The moment of execution had arrived, demanding a split in Silas's focus between the mechanical act of arson and the emotional necessity of farewell. He could not strike the spark without first ensuring Cora was poised for flight. Yet every second he lingered increased the probability of discovery. He moved away from the cotton stacks, melting into the deeper shadows near the edge of the yard, where the manicured grounds gave way to the tangled undergrowth of the woods. There was a specific location, a blind spot behind the old smokehouse, where the jasmine grew wild and thick, that served as their designated rendezvous point. The air here was cooler, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the river, a stark contrast to the dry, dusty smell of the cotton he was about to ignite. Cora was already waiting, her silhouette barely discernible against the rough-hewn timber of the building. She stood with the stillness of a hunted creature, her eyes scanning the darkness for his approach. In her hands, she clutched a small bundle, the sum total of her possessions and the provisions for the journey ahead. As Silas emerged from the gloom, the tension in her posture relaxed slightly, replaced by a grim determination. They did not speak immediately. Words were a luxury they could not afford, and in this final hour, their connection transcended language. He reached out, taking her hand, and the contact was electric, a grounding force that steeled his resolve. The pseudo-documentary record of their plan suggests a high degree of sophisticated coordination, unusual for acts of resistance in this era. Silas leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear, as he delivered the final, crucial instructions. "The wind is from the south," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the chirping cicadas. "It will push the flames toward the house and the river road. You must go north, into the swamps. Do not stop until you hear the chaos." He pressed the oil-soaked rags into her understanding, explaining that the light of the fire would be her clock. She was to move only when the sky turned red, using the distraction to breach the perimeter. Cora nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. She was a slight woman, but there was an iron core within her that the brutal conditions of Greenwood Place had failed to break. "I have the pouch," she whispered back, referring to the small leather sack she had prepared. "And I know the signs, the crooked branch, the stacked stones." She recited the markers he had risked so much to create, proving she had committed the path to memory. This exchange was vital. A single missed marker in the dense, disorienting wilderness could spell capture or death. Her competence was his only reassurance, a fragile shield against the terror of the unknown. Silas looked at her, his eyes tracing the contours of her face in the dim light, memorizing her features. He knew with a sickening certainty that he might never see her again, that this plan could easily end in blood and separation. "When you reach the water," he continued, his voice cracking slightly, "look for the boatman. He knows. He will sing the Song of Zion." This was the linchpin of the escape, a fragile thread of trust extended to a stranger on the river. He had arranged for passage, a terrifying gamble that relied on the honor of a man he had never met, a link in the invisible chain of the Underground Railroad. They stood together for a moment longer, two souls suspended in the terrifying gravity of the choice they had made. The weight of the past, the suffering of their ancestors, and the crushing burden of their daily existence pressed upon them, but it was overshadowed by the prospect of a future, however uncertain. Silas knew that the act he was about to commit was irreversible. It would sever them from everything they knew, casting them adrift in a hostile world. Yet, remaining was a slower, more insidious death. He lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture of devotion and apology, before turning back toward the yard. As he retreated, Silas felt the last vestiges of his old self fall away. The compliant field hand, the passive guardian, the man who lowered his eyes to avoid the lash, that man was dead. In his place stood a rebel, an architect of destruction. He approached the cotton stacks with the oily rags in hand, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He crouched low, shielded by the towering bales, and pulled the stolen flint and steel from his pocket. The metal was cold against his skin, a shocking contrast to the feverish heat of his anticipation. He placed the bundle of rags at the base of a bale, positioned perfectly to catch the driving southern wind. With a steadiness that surprised him, he struck the steel against the flint. A shower of sparks erupted, bright and brief, landing on the grease-stained fabric. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a thin curl of smoke rose, twisting in the air, followed by a sputtering orange glow. The oil caught fire with a sudden, hungry hiss, and the flame began to lap at the dry, packed cotton fibers. Silas did not wait to watch the fire take hold. He knew the nature of the material. Once ignited, the cotton would burn with a ferocity that defied belief. He backed away, moving quickly but calmly to a position near the toolshed, where he could observe the unfolding chaos while staying hidden. Almost immediately, the small flame found purchase, blooming into a roaring sheet of orange light. The wind caught the flames, whipping them into a frenzy, and the fire leapt from one bale to the next with terrifying speed. The silence of the night was shattered by the crackling roar of the inferno. The white gold of Jefferson County was being consumed. The fire climbed the stacks, casting dancing shadows across the yard and painting the underside of the clouds in a bruised, angry purple. The heat was already intense, radiating outward like a physical blow. Silas watched as the first shouts began to ring out from the slave quarters, cries of alarm and terror. The plan was in motion. The rebellion had begun. He took a deep breath, the smoke filling his lungs, and prepared for the next phase. The fight for their lives. The conflagration at Greenwood Place did not merely burn. It roared with a voice that seemed to challenge the very heavens. The dry-packed cotton, enriched by the oils Silas had applied, acted as a potent accelerant, transforming the storage yard into a cauldron of unimaginable heat. Historians note that the brightness of the blaze was sufficient to illuminate the town of Rodney, miles distant, causing residents to believe the stars themselves had fallen into the river. For Silas, however, the inferno was a calculated diversion, a chaotic symphony designed to shatter the rigid discipline of the plantation. He stood for a moment, his silhouette cast long and flickering against the tool shed, watching the financial empire of Marcus Caldwell crumble into ash. The structural integrity of the stacks failed rapidly, sending up great geysers of sparks that swirled in the southern wind like furious fireflies. The initial shockwave of heat and light triggered the expected pandemonium. Doors slammed open across the slave quarters, and terrified figures poured out into the night, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. The air filled with a cacophony of shouts, the barking of dogs, and the frantic ringing of the plantation bell. Silas remained still, a point of calm amidst the turbulence, his eyes scanning the periphery. He watched for the specific shadow he knew would be moving away from the danger, not toward it. There, at the edge of the light's reach, he saw Cora. She moved with a fluid, practiced grace, slipping into the dark mouth of the forest without a backward glance. The sight of her departure was the final key turning in the lock of his plan. With Cora's safety momentarily secured, Silas turned his attention to the immediate tactical necessity of delaying the pursuit. The destruction of the cotton was a profound economic blow, but it was the physical incapacitation of the plantation's command structure that would buy them the precious hours they needed. He gripped his heavy wooden club, the weapon of his enforced guardianship, and moved toward the fray. He did not run or panic. Instead, he adopted the demeanor of a loyal slave rushing to aid his masters, a disguise that allowed him to maneuver through the chaos unquestioned. His target was Hatcher, the overseer, whose predictable rage would surely bring him to the heart of the disaster. True to form, Hatcher burst from his cabin, his face twisted in apoplectic fury, brandishing a bullwhip as if it could lash the flames into submission. He screamed orders at the fleeing field hands, demanding they form a bucket brigade, his voice cracking with the strain of authority slipping through his fingers. The overseer's gaze swept the yard and landed on Silas, standing near the edge of the burning pyre. "You fool!" Hatcher roared, charging forward with the whip raised. "How did this happen? Get to the pump, or I'll tear the skin from your back!" He was blind with rage, oblivious to the calculated stillness of the man he approached. Silas did not cower. He did not plead for mercy or scramble to obey. As Hatcher closed the distance, drawing back the whip for a vicious strike, Silas stepped into the blow's arc, a maneuver completely unexpected by the overseer. He raised his club not in a wild panic, but with the precision of a woodsman felling a tree. The heavy wood connected with Hatcher's leading knee. The sound of the bone shattering was sickeningly loud, even above the roar of the fire. Hatcher collapsed instantly, his scream turning into a wail of agony as he crumpled into the dirt, his whip falling uselessly beside him. The act was swift, brutal, and final. By taking down the primary enforcer of the estate, Silas had effectively decapitated the plantation's immediate ability to organize a pursuit. The other slaves, frozen in a moment of shock, looked from the writhing overseer to the burning cotton, and then to Silas. In that glance, a silent understanding passed. They saw not a crime, but a retribution long overdue. Without a word, Silas turned his back on the broken man and the burning wealth, melting into the thick, billowing smoke that was now drifting northward, providing him with the perfect cover for his own disappearance. As he fled, the legend of the Firewalker began to take root in the fertile soil of the community's collective memory. Witnesses would later speak of a figure who did not run from the flames, but seemed to command them, a specter of retribution who moved through the inferno untouched. They whispered that Silas had not merely struck a man, but had struck down the symbol of their oppression, leaving him broken in the dust, while the source of the master's wealth turned to smoke. This immediate mythologization was a defense mechanism, a way to process the unthinkable event, transforming a desperate escape into an act of divine justice. The journey from the yard to the forest edge was a harrowing sprint through a landscape turned alien by firelight. Silas could feel the heat singeing his hair, the breath of the beast he had unleashed hot on his neck. He ducked behind the blacksmith shed, utilizing the pre-planned route he had memorized during his days of feigned docility. Every shadow seemed to hide a pursuer. Every crackle of burning wood sounded like a footstep. Yet, the chaos he had created was working exactly as intended. The white men of the plantation were too consumed with saving the remaining structures and tending to the shrieking hatcher to notice one missing slave. Once he crossed the threshold of the tree line, the world shifted from a hellscape of orange and red to a profound, disorienting blackness. The dense canopy of the Mississippi woods blocked out the firelight, plunging him into a world of shadow. Here, the silence was heavy, broken only by the distant roar of the fire and the frantic calls of the men he had left behind. Silas paused for a moment to catch his breath, his chest heaving, the adrenaline turning his limbs to jelly. To create a false trail for any dogs for any dogs that might eventually be brought in. The ground was soft and damp beneath his feet, a sensation that grounded him in the reality of his flight. He knew that old Hiram, the village elder, had warned him of the dogs, the trackers, and the certain death that awaited runaways. But as Silas moved deeper into the woods, leaving the chaos of Greenwood Place behind, he realized that the fear of the hunt was already transforming into a sharp, focused resolve. He was no longer property, he was prey, and prey had a chance to vanish. The night air, no longer thick with the smell of burning cotton, now carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Silas navigated by the stars, finding the North Star through a gap in the canopy, his compass in the trackless dark. The plan was far from over. The river lay ahead, and with it, the most dangerous crossing of his life. But the first step was complete. The bridge to his old life had been burned, quite literally, and there was no turning back. He pushed forward, a shadow among shadows, driven by the image of Cora waiting at the rendezvous, and the promise of a dawn where he would wake a free man. The dawn broke over Jefferson County with a grim gray finality, exposing the extent of the devastation at Greenwood Place. Where once stood mountains of wealth, there now lay a sprawling, smoldering wasteland of black ash and charred timber. Marcus Caldwell, the master of the estate, stood amidst the ruin, his boots covered in soot, his face a mask of trembling disbelief. The financial loss was staggering, estimated by local merchants at nearly $40,000, a sum that threatened to unravel the entire economic foundation of his holdings. But as he stared at the steaming earth, his shock began to transmute into a cold, venomous rage. He turned his gaze not toward the burnt cotton, but toward the empty quarters, his mind already fixated on the theft of his property that had occurred under the cover of the fire he had just witnessed. The overseer Hatcher, his legs splinted with rough timber and bound with strips of torn bedsheet, was hauled before Caldwell on a mule-drawn cart. The man was a portrait of agony and humiliation, his face pale, and slick with sweat. He recounted the night's events through gritted teeth, his narrative carefully constructed to minimize his own failure, while emphasizing the treachery he had faced. He spoke of Silas not as a man, but as a cunning devil who had exploited the chaos to strike him down. "It was a planned insurrection, master," Hatcher rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and hatred. "He shattered my leg and vanished. And the woman, Cora, she is gone too. They are together in this." Caldwell's response was chilling in its quietude. He did not scream or thrash about. He merely tightened his jaw, the muscles in his neck cording with tension. He understood that this was more than a loss of capital. It was a rupture of the social order, a direct challenge to his authority that, if left unanswered, would set a dangerous precedent for the entire county. He summoned his remaining overseers and the local patrol, his voice low and precise. "I want a net cast wide," he commanded. "Check every road, every ferry crossing, every abandoned shack from here to the river. No slave moves without a pass. I want them found." The machinery of repression began to grind into motion with terrifying efficiency. Riders were dispatched to the neighboring plantations, carrying descriptions of the fugitives and promising a lavish reward for their capture. Posters were hastily printed in Rodney, offering $500 for the return of Silas and Cora, dead or alive. The notice described Silas as dangerous and cunning, warning citizens of his capacity for violence. This pseudo-documentary artifact, the wanted poster, serves as a stark testament to the paranoia that gripped the region in the wake of the fire, transforming a local escape into a regional crisis. While the civilians mobilized, a more specialized threat was being summoned from the underbelly of the slave-catching trade. Caldwell, dissatisfied with the capabilities of his regular patrol, sent a messenger to summon a man known only as Vance. Vance was a tracker of infamous repute, a man who hunted men not for the money alone, but for the satisfaction of the intellectual contest. He operated on the fringe of legality, a mercenary whose methods were rumored to be as effective as they were brutal. His involvement signaled that the hunt for Silas had escalated from a standard recovery operation to a manhunt of the highest priority. Vance arrived at Greenwood Place by mid-afternoon, a lean, predatory figure with eyes the color of flint. He did not immediately join the noisy, chaotic search parties beating the bushes near the plantation. Instead, he walked to the edge of the woods, crouching low to examine the earth. He noted the depth of the footprints and the direction of the stride. He saw the signs that others missed: a broken spiderweb here, a disturbed mold there. He deduced that the fugitives had split up initially to confuse the dogs, a tactic that immediately told him he was tracking an intelligent adversary, not a panicked animal. The tracker's analysis led him to the river road. He found the spot where Cora had entered the denser thicket, her lighter footprint distinguishable from Silas's heavier tread. Vance stood silently, his mind reconstructing the timeline of the escape. He realized the fire had been a masterpiece of misdirection, a calculated sacrifice that had bought the fugitives a lead of several hours. He touched the trigger of his rifle, a grim smile touching his lips. The challenge was significant, but he knew that every trail, no matter how cold, eventually led to a capture. The news of the fire and the escape spread rapidly through the slave communities of the county, carried in hushed whispers from cabin to cabin. The story was already growing in the telling, magnified by the awe of those who had witnessed the inferno. They spoke of Silas as a figure of myth, a man who had called down fire from the sky to break his chains. This psychological contagion, as historians might term it, terrified the white planters almost as much as the loss of the cotton, for it suggested that their control was an illusion maintained only by the compliance of the oppressed. Caldwell, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, doubled the patrols around the remaining slave quarters, imposing a strict curfew. He feared that the infection of rebellion might spread, that others might be inspired by Silas's defiance. The air in the quarters was thick with a mix of fear and a secret, exultant hope. The destruction of the cotton fields was a visible scar on the landscape, but the absence of Silas and Cora was an invisible wound on the master's pride, a constant reminder that his power had limits. The narrative of the hunt was now set, a deadly game of chess played across the dark swamps and winding rivers of Mississippi. Vance took command of the search, integrating the local dogs with his own keen instincts. He had a reputation for never returning empty-handed, a statistic that weighed heavily on the minds of those who wished for Silas's success. As the sun began to set on the first day of the manhunt, the tracker set his course northward, toward the vast, fog-shrouded expanse of the Mississippi River, knowing that water was the only true escape route available. For Silas and Cora, the world had shrunk to a terrifying dichotomy: the burning hell they had left behind, and the unknown darkness that lay ahead. The mobilization of the trackers meant that their window of safety was closing rapidly. The pseudo-documentary evidence of the era, including journals and ledger entries, indicates that successful escapes were statistical anomalies, rare victories against a system designed to be inescapable. Yet, as Vance began his pursuit, the odds were already being defied. The fire at Greenwood Place, burning not just cotton, but the certainty of the status quo. The narrative focus shifts from the organized chaos of the manhunt to the solitary, terrifying ordeal of Cora. She had entered the swamplands that bordered the plantation, a treacherous expanse of bog and briar, known locally as the Drowning Grounds. The darkness here was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against her eyes, broken only by the occasional eerie dance of swamp gas. Every step was a gamble between solid earth and the sucking mire that threatened to pull her down into the black mud. The distant orange glow of Greenwood Place was now a fading memory, replaced by the immediate, visceral reality of survival. She moved with a caution born of desperation, her body low, her hands reaching out to navigate the tangled vegetation that clawed at her face and arms. The psychological toll of the flight was immediate and crushing. Cora was entirely alone, severed from the only world she had ever known, driven forward by the singular hope that Silas had successfully executed his part of the plan. The silence of the swamp was deceptive. It was a cacophony of natural sounds: the chirping of tree frogs, the splash of water snakes, the rustle of nocturnal creatures that kept her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She was acutely aware that every rustle could be a patroller, every snapping twig a bloodhound. This isolation forced her to rely entirely on the mental map Silas had constructed for her, a series of instructions whispered in the dark that now stood between her and recapture. Her progress was agonizingly slow. The terrain offered no mercy, transforming from muddy creek beds to dense thickets of saw palmetto that sliced at her skin. Yet, Cora possessed a reservoir of resilience that the harsh regime of the plantation had failed to deplete. She recalled the markers Silas had described, looking for the specific aberrations in nature that would signal she was on the right path. When she finally stumbled upon the first sign, a distinctive, unnatural break in a sycamore branch, her heart surged with a fierce, quiet triumph. It was tangible proof that Silas had been there before her, a ghostly handshake across the miles of danger that separated them. The journey continued for what felt like hours, a grueling test of endurance. Cora followed the trail of markers with religious fervor. A stone balanced on a log, a strip of bark peeled from a sweet gum tree. These signs were not just directional aids, they were a language of love and defiance. However, the environment soon presented a more formidable barrier. A slow-moving, murky creek that bisected the woodland. She knew that to linger on the bank was to die, yet the water was black and unknown. Steeling her nerve, she waded in, the cold rising to her waist, the current pulling at her legs. She moved downstream to confuse any scent trail, her body trembling from the chill and the adrenaline. As she emerged on the opposite bank, shivering and exhausted, Cora faced the next stage of the plan. Silas had spoken of helpers, a shadow network of brave souls who risked everything to aid fugitives. She needed to find a specific homestead, a place of sanctuary marked by a quilt hung on a line, or perhaps a lantern in a window. The concept of strangers helping strangers was almost alien to her, a radical idea that challenged her lifelong experience of mistrust. But she pushed forward, driven by the memory of Silas's voice urging her north, toward the river, and the promise of the boatman. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, Cora had reached the edge of a small, isolated clearing. There, nestled against the backdrop of the dense forest, stood a modest farmhouse. She observed it from the cover of the woods, watching for any sign of danger, her body rigid with tension. The house was quiet, its chimney smokeless in the early morning chill. She spotted a clothesline, and there, fluttering faintly in the breeze, was a patterned quilt. It was a signal, a beacon in the wilderness that offered a momentary respite from the relentless terror of the hunt. With the last reserves of her strength, Cora staggered toward the back of the property. She was met by a woman whose face was lined with age and kindness, a stark contrast to the harsh visages of the overseer she had left behind. The woman did not speak, but quickly ushered Cora into a root cellar beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. The space was dark and smelled of earth and stored potatoes, but to Cora, it was a palace. The woman pressed a piece of cornbread and a cup of water into her hands before sealing the hatch, leaving Cora alone in the blessed, quiet dark to rest and wait for the night. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Silas was intensifying with a terrifying focus. Vance, the relentless tracker, had picked up the trail near the edge of the swamp. He moved with a predatory silence, his eyes reading the narrative of the ground with practiced ease. He found the spot where Silas had entered the water, noting the disturbance in the mud and the direction of the current. Vance was not like the other patrollers who relied solely on the baying of hounds. He understood the psychology of the runaway. He knew that Silas would use the water to mask his scent, a tactic that would force the dogs to cast about wildly, losing precious time. Vance decided to anticipate, rather than merely follow. He surmised that Silas would not linger in the deep swamp, but would angle toward the higher ground that led to the river. He split his party, sending the dogs and the louder men on a false trail downstream, while he took a small, silent group upstream. This strategic divergence raised the stakes significantly, turning the hunt into a duel of wits. Vance was now operating on intuition and logic, guessing Silas's ultimate destination, the Mississippi River, the Great Barrier, and the only viable route to true freedom. The parallel trajectories of husband and wife began to converge toward the water. While Cora rested in the hidden cellar, gathering strength for the final push, Silas was moving through the underbrush, every step bringing him closer to the rendezvous point. He was unaware of Vance's strategic maneuvering, but he felt the pressure of the hunt like a hand on his shoulder. He knew that the sanctuary provided by the fire was fading, replaced by the cold efficiency of the man who tracked him. The river lay ahead, a massive shifting border that represented both the end of the chase and the beginning of a new peril. The intersection of these paths was imminent. The pseudo-documentary record of the Underground Railroad suggests that the final miles of a flight were often the most perilous, a bottleneck where the forces of suppression concentrated their efforts. Cora's survival depended on her ability to link up with the river guide, while Silas's safety relied on outthinking Vance. The small farmhouse and the hidden root cellar were merely temporary pauses in a much larger, fluid drama that was rushing toward a climax on the banks of the Mississippi. The clock was ticking, and the shadow of the noose hung heavy over the landscape. The sanctuary provided by the root cellar was fleeting, a mere pause in the relentless current of events. When darkness reclaimed the landscape, Cora emerged from her earthen haven. Her body rested, but her spirit tight with anxiety. The Quaker woman, a figure of stoic resolve, pressed a bundle into Cora's hands containing hardtack and a strip of dried meat. She offered final, hushed instructions, confirming the path to the river landing where a specific boatman waited. This interaction, a link in the invisible chain of the Underground Railroad, highlighted the dangerous altruism that defied the laws of the land. Cora departed the farmstead under the cloak of twilight, stepping back into the hostile unknown with a new destination etched into her mind. Her route now took her through the dense pine forests that bordered the river floodplains. The terrain here was deceptive, a mix of spongy loam and sudden treacherous drops into gullies. Cora moved with a heightened sense of awareness, the warning of the Quaker woman echoing in her ears. She knew that professional patrollers often staked out the high ground, scanning the lower paths for movement. To counter this, she kept to the shadows of the ridgelines, sacrificing speed for stealth. The night air was turning cooler, a precursor to the autumn chill, and the wind whispered through the pine needles, creating a sound like the ocean that both masked her footsteps and amplified her paranoia. The mental strain of the journey was beginning to manifest in physical tremors. Cora fought the urge to run blindly toward the river, knowing that panic was a precursor to capture. She had to trust in Silas's planning, believing that he had accounted for this final, grueling leg of the journey. The markers he had laid were now behind her. She was navigating by the stars and the crude directions given by the Quaker. This shift from following a prepared trail to navigating by instinct and intellect marked a crucial evolution in her character. She was no longer merely a passenger in Silas's plan, but an active navigator of her own destiny. As she neared the river lowlands, the ground became saturated, the air thick with the scent of rot and wet earth. The Mississippi River, though unseen, announced its presence through the distant, rhythmic lapping of water against the clay banks. Cora paused at the edge of a clearing, her eyes scanning for the silhouette of a skiff or the glow of a signal lantern. The Quaker had mentioned a boatman who sang of Zion, a coded reference that served as both a password and a test of faith. The isolation was absolute, a void in which any shape could be a savior or an executioner. While Cora navigated the lowlands, the antagonist, Vance, was executing a strategic pincer movement. Having deduced that the fugitives were aiming for the river, he had ridden hard to cut off the most logical crossing points. Vance was not a man who relied solely on the brute force of dogs. He understood the geometry of escape. He positioned his men at the primary landings, while he himself took a smaller, auxiliary path to a lesser-known crossing, betting on the intelligence of his quarry. He reasoned that a man as clever as Silas would avoid the obvious ferries, choosing a secluded bank where the fog could offer concealment. Vance's intuition was rewarded. In the soft mud of a deer trail, he found a partial print, a human footmark distinct from the cloven hooves of local game. The track was fresh, the edges still sharp, indicating that his prey was close. A grim satisfaction settled over Vance's features. He dismounted, signaling his men to silence. The hunt was no longer a broad search. It was now a localized stalk. The distance between hunter and hunted had collapsed, measured not in miles, but in yards. The tension was palpable. A vibrating wire stretched taut across the darkened woods. Silas, meanwhile, was moving through the same sector of the forest, parallel to Cora, but separated by a ridge of dense undergrowth. He was exhausted, his body pushed to the limits of endurance, but the proximity to the river buoyed his spirits. He had heard the distant baying of hounds earlier in the evening, but the sound had faded, suggesting he had outmaneuvered the main patrol. However, he remained hyper-vigilant. He knew that the final approach to the river was the most dangerous moment, the choke point, where panic often led to failure. He scanned the tree line, looking for the signal that would indicate the boatman's presence. The convergence of these three trajectories, Cora, Silas, and Vance, was an inevitability of physics and strategy. The river acted as a magnet, drawing all parties to its edge. Cora reached the bank first, crouching behind a fallen cypress. She peered through the mist, her heart hammering against her ribs. 100 yards downstream, a shape materialized in the fog, a small skiff moored to a willow tree. Standing beside it was a solitary figure, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. This was the moment of truth, the final test of the code that Silas had risked everything to arrange. She waited, watching for any sign of an ambush, her hand tightening around the small knife Silas had given her. The figure by the boat did not move, his posture patient and still. Taking a steadying breath, Cora prepared to step out from cover and offer the signal. The air was thick with moisture, dampening sounds and distorting distances. It was a surreal, almost dreamlike atmosphere, where the line between freedom and capture seemed as fluid as the river itself. Unbeknownst to Cora, Vance had spotted her. From his vantage point on a rise above the riverbank, he saw the crouching figure near the fallen cypress. He raised his rifle, drawing a bead on the shape. He hesitated, however, lowering the weapon slightly. He wanted the man, not just the woman. He knew that if he waited, Silas would show himself, drawn by the same instinct to the water. Vance settled into the shadows, a predator waiting for the flock to gather before striking. The stage was set for the climax. The river, the fog, and the boatman waited in the silence. Cora stood on the precipice of salvation, while Silas moved through the dark woods toward her voice. Vance watched with cold patience, his finger resting on the trigger. The narrative machinery had stripped away all distractions, leaving only the raw, essential conflict between the desire for liberty and the enforcement of tyranny. The next few moments would determine if the legend of the Firewalker would end in triumph or tragedy. The silence of the riverbank was shattered by a low, mournful cry, a signal that Silas had practiced in the quiet of his cabin for months. It was the call of a screech owl, a sound common enough to the Mississippi lowlands, but in the context of the escape, it served as a lifeline. Cora, hidden behind the fallen cypress, heard the signal and felt a surge of relief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. She watched the figure by the skiff, the boatman, who paused at the sound. He turned his head toward the dense wall of cane and timber, waiting. The rendezvous was initiated, and the delicate machinery of the final extraction began to turn. Silas emerged from the tree line, his body moving with a tense, predatory caution. He was close now, but the open ground between the forest and the riverbank was a kill zone if the patrollers were near. He scanned the shadows, his eyes straining against the oppressive gray of the fog. Seeing no immediate threat, he broke cover, sprinting toward the water. His arrival was not a moment too soon. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of fear. He reached Cora's hiding spot, and for a brief second, their eyes met, a silent communication of love and terror, before they moved together toward the waiting boat. The boatman, a grizzled figure with skin weathered by the sun and river wind, stepped forward to steady the skiff as they approached. He did not speak, his silence a professional discipline. He offered a hand to Cora first, helping her over the gunwale into the bottom of the boat. Silas followed, pushing the craft off the muddy bank with a powerful shove of his leg. The river accepted them, the dark water swirling around the hull. The boatman took up the oars, his movements fluid and practiced, easing them into the main current where the fog waited to swallow them whole. Suddenly, the tranquility of the crossing was annihilated. From the ridge above, a sharp crack echoed, splitting the night air. A rifle shot kicked up a spray of water just inches from the bow of the skiff. Vance had revealed his position, his patience exhausted by the sight of his quarry slipping away. "Halt!" A voice roared from the darkness, followed by the crashing of underbrush as the tracker and his men scrambled down the bank. The illusion of a silent escape was gone, replaced by the frantic reality of a desperate flight. The boatman dug his oars deep, pulling against the water with a strength that belied his age. Silas lay flat in the bottom of the boat, shielding Cora with his body. Another shot rang out, this one tearing through the fabric of the boatman's coat, but missing the flesh. The fog was their only ally now, a shifting wall of white that began to obscure them from the shore. The muzzle flashes from the bank were like angry fireflies, bright and brief, unable to penetrate the growing density of the mist. Vance stood at the water's edge, his rifle smoking, his face twisted in a mask of fury and disbelief. He screamed orders to his men to find a boat, but he knew the delay would be fatal to his chances. The current was strong, and the skiff was already dissolving into the white void. The tracker's reputation for success had met its match in the weather and the sheer determination of the fugitives. He fired a final, hopeful shot into the fog, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the river. Inside the skiff, the world had narrowed to the sound of the oars and the heavy breathing of the three occupants. Cora clung to Silas, her fingers digging into his arms as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. The boatman maintained his rhythm, his breathing steady despite the graze on his side. He did not look back. To look back was to hesitate, and hesitation on the Mississippi meant death. The fog closed around them like a shroud, severing the connection to the shore and the world of bondage they had left behind. The crossing was a blur of gray and black, a liminal space between the life of a slave and the life of a fugitive. They drifted with the current, silent witnesses to their own rebirth. The sounds of the hunt, the shouting men, the baying dogs, faded into the distance, replaced by the lapping of water against the wood. This period of transition is often overlooked in popular retellings, yet it was the crucible in which their freedom was forged. They were no longer property. They were survivors, adrift in the arms of the river. After what felt like an eternity, the silhouette of the far bank began to materialize through the mist. It was a different world, a landscape of dense willows and high ground. The boatman guided the skiff into a small hidden inlet, the water here calmer, the silence profound. They had crossed the Great Divide. The landing was executed with precision, the keel grinding softly into the sand. Silas jumped out first, waist deep in the water, turning to help Cora onto the solid ground of freedom. The boatman pointed toward a path leading away from the river, toward a settlement where others would take over the chain of protection. He did not ask for thanks, nor did he offer blessings. He simply nodded, a gesture of professional respect. He pushed his boat back into the current, returning to the other side to cover his tracks and maintain the secrecy of the operation. He was a ghost in the machine, a critical link that would leave no trace in the pseudo-documentary record. Silas and Cora stood on the bank, shivering and exhausted, but undeniably free. They held each other, the reality of their escape settling in with the cold air. The fire at Greenwood Place had been the catalyst, but the river had been the true test. They turned their backs on the water and began to climb the bank, walking into the dense thicket that marked the beginning of their new life. The journey was far from over, but the chain was broken, the shadow of the noose lifted by the fog. The immediate aftermath of the crossing was not a moment of celebration, but one of profound, disorienting silence. Silas and Cora stood on the northern bank of the Mississippi, the fog swirling around them like a shroud, effectively severing the visual tether to the world they had fled. The physical reality of freedom was stark. They were shivering, soaked to the bone, and standing in a foreign wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Yet, the absence of the lash, the absence of the overseer's voice, created a vacuum that was almost painful in its newness. They were no longer pieces of inventory to be tallied in a ledger. They were two souls adrift in the vast, unmapped territory of liberty. The boatman's directions had been precise, guiding them toward a small hamlet of free people of color, a settlement nestled in the dense timber away from the river's edge. As they moved inland, the adrenaline that had carried them through the night began to ebb, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion. Every step was a negotiation with fatigued muscles and the treacherous, root-choked terrain. Silas kept a protective arm around Cora, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit, though he knew the river had bought them a temporary reprieve. The free soil beneath their feet felt unstable, a psychological shift as much as a geographical one. They arrived at a modest cabin, distinguished only by a single unlit lantern hanging by the door, a signal of safety in a world of shadows. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman whose face was a map of quiet resolve. She ushered them inside quickly, bolting the door against the night. The interior was sparse but warm, heated by a small hearth that glowed with dying embers. The woman did not ask for their story. In this network of resistance, stories were dangerous, and the scars on their backs told the only narrative that mattered. She offered them dry clothes and hot broth, the simple acts of humanity cutting through their shock. For the first time in their lives, Silas and Cora slept without the fear of a pre-dawn horn. The sleep was deep and dreamless, a black void of necessary healing. When they woke, the gray light of afternoon was filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls. The reality of their situation began to settle in. They were safe for the moment, but free was a relative term in a nation deeply divided. They were now fugitives, forever looking over their shoulders, their existence dependent on the kindness of strangers and the silence of the woods. Meanwhile, the failure at the river landing had sent shockwaves back through the pursuit. Vance, the tracker, had returned to the Caldwell plantation with news that was received with apoplectic rage. Marcus Caldwell, faced with the total loss of his cotton crop and the escape of his human property, found his authority crumbling. The pseudo-documentary record indicates that Caldwell's financial standing in Jefferson County never recovered from the events of that night. The loss of nearly $40,000 in assets, combined with the public embarrassment of being outwitted, marked the beginning of the planters' descent into obscurity. Vance's reputation, previously unblemished, suffered a significant blow. The tracker was a man who prided himself on the intellectual conquest of his quarry, and Silas had bested him using the terrain and the elements. The tracker vanished from the official records of the county soon after, a figure who had met his match in the fog. The manhunt that had been mobilized with such ferocity gradually dissipated, the dogs returning to their kennels, the riders to their farms. The firewalker had slipped the net, leaving behind only a frustrated and humiliated posse. Back in the slave quarters of Greenwood Place, the mood was a complex tapestry of fear and hidden jubilation. The physical punishment inflicted on the remaining slaves was severe, a brutal attempt by Caldwell to reassert dominance. Yet, the psychological damage was done. The story of Silas and Cora had already begun to crystallize into legend. The fire was no longer seen as an accident or a crime, but as an act of divine retribution. The older slaves whispered that Silas had not run, but had flown, transformed by the heat of the flames into a spirit that could not be caged. This process of mythologization served a vital function for the enslaved community. It provided a counter-narrative to the omnipotence of the master class. If a man could burn the harvest, break the overseer, and vanish into the fog, then the system was not invincible. Silas became a symbol of the unbreakable, a ghost story told to frighten children and inspire adults. His name was rarely spoken aloud in the presence of white people, but in the quiet dark of the cabins, it was an invocation of hope. Silas and Cora eventually moved on from the initial safe house, continuing their journey northward toward more established free territories. They traveled by night, guided by the North Star and the intricate network of the Underground Railroad. The trauma of the flight stayed with them. Silas would forever carry a tension in his shoulders, and Cora a startled look in her eyes. But they were together. The bond that had been tested by fire and water emerged stronger, the central pillar of their new existence. The transition from fugitives to free people was a slow, arduous process of rebuilding identity. They had to learn to navigate a world where they could own their own labor, make their own choices, and speak their own minds. The shadow of the plantation was long, but with every mile they put between themselves and the Mississippi, the dimmer it grew. They were no longer defined by what they lacked, but by what they had seized, their own agency. The fire at Greenwood Place was a wound on the landscape, but for them, it was the light that showed the way out. Years later, the story of the fire would still be told, evolving with each retelling. Historians might debate the exact facts of the night in 1837, but the truth of the narrative lay not in the ledger books or the wanted posters. It lay in the enduring legacy of resistance. Silas and Cora had proven that the human spirit, when cornered, could ignite with a fury that no amount of oppression could extinguish. They had walked through the fire, and on the other side, they had found themselves. The final accounting of the Greenwood Place insurrection reveals a stark disparity between the official records and the oral traditions that survived in the river parishes. Ledger books from the Rodney Mercantile indicate that Marcus Caldwell never recovered from the destruction of his autumn harvest. The loss of the cotton, coupled with the substantial bounty he paid for the failed capture, forced the once proud planter into a spiral of debt and despondency. He died less than 5 years later, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his estate auctioned off to satisfy creditors. The fire, it seemed, had consumed more than just fiber. It had burned the very foundation of his world. The fate of Hatcher, the overseer, serves as a grim footnote to the rebellion. The shattering of his leg left him permanently crippled, unfit for the brutal demands of plantation discipline. Cast aside by the system he served with such cruelty, he faded into the margins of history, a broken man often seen begging on the streets of Natchez. This physical ruination mirrored the psychological blow struck against the overseer class. For the enslaved population, The sight of the once feared driver limping through town was a tangible testament to the fallibility of their oppressors, a silent victory that played out in the public square. Vance the Tracker, whose reputation had been staked on the capture of the Firewalker, vanished from the region's police reports following the river crossing. Oral histories suggest that he retreated to the Western Territories, unable to reconcile his failure with his professional pride. He had met an intellect that matched his own, and in the fog of the Mississippi, he had been defeated not by strength, but by strategy. His absence served to further inflate the legend of Silas, transforming the fugitive into a figure who could outmatch the greatest hunter in the territory. The narrative of Silas and Cora, however, followed a different trajectory, one hidden in the coded correspondence of the Underground Railroad. Letters discovered in the archives of a Quaker settlement in Ohio confirmed the arrival of a couple matching their description in the spring of 1838. They had traveled over 1,000 miles, navigating the intricate network of safe houses and conductors, sustained by the same coordinated effort that had seen them across the river. Their arrival was not marked by fanfare, but by the quiet, profound dignity of survival. In their new life, Silas and Cora did not seek notoriety. They adopted new surnames, burying the identities that had been forged in bondage. Silas found work as a blacksmith, his skills finally serving his own prosperity rather than his master's. Cora became a seamstress, her stitches now weaving a future for her own family. They were ordinary citizens in a free community, yet to those who knew their story, they were living monuments to resistance. Their home became a stop on the road to freedom, a way station for others who followed the North Star. The legend of the Firewalker continued to evolve in the South, growing independently of the real man. In the quarters of Jefferson County, the story was retold with mythological embellishments. Silas was no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a spirit conjured by the collective suffering of the enslaved. It was said that he could walk through flames unharmed, that he could shape-shift into a marsh hawk to evade the dogs, and that he had left a curse upon the land of Greenwood Place. This mythologization was a survival mechanism, a way to process the trauma of the event, and to keep the flame of hope alive. This folklore served a dual purpose. It terrified the planter class and emboldened the oppressed. Masters began to look at the black gold in their fields with a hint of fear, seeing in the white fibers the potential for their own ruin. The story of the fire became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the laborers who tended the crops held the power to destroy them. The psychological contract of slavery, based on the premise of total submission, had been irrevocably breached by the events of that October night. Historians analyzing the period note that the Greenwood Fire was part of a larger pattern of resistance that escalated in the years preceding the Civil War. While isolated in its execution, it resonated with the tension of the era. The pseudo-documentary evidence, newspaper clippings expressing outrage, private journals detailing the fear of insurrection, paints a picture of a society on edge. Silas's act was a spark in a dry forest, a precursor to the conflagration that would eventually sweep across the nation and burn the institution of slavery to the ground. For Silas and Cora, the scars of their flight remained, both visible and invisible. There were nights when Silas would wake in a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke in his nostrils, or Cora would start at the sound of a dog barking in the distance. But these scars were badges of honor, reminders of the price they had paid for their liberty. They had walked through the drowning grounds of the swamp and the valley of the shadow of the hunt, and they had emerged on the other side. The story of Silas and Cora stands as a testament to the indomitable nature of the human will. It is a narrative that transcends the specific dates and locations of 1837, speaking to the universal desire for self-determination. They did not wait for freedom to be granted. They seized it with their own hands, forging a legacy that would outlast the plantations, the overseers, and the laws that sought to define them. The fire they set was a beacon, illuminating the path for generations to come, proving that some bonds are meant to be burned.